I'll go directly to our first guest, and that is Malezer. He's an Aboriginal activist campaigning for the human rights of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, including wide participation in the human rights of Indigenous peoples at international level. Now retired, but still active as a voluntary worker. His long involvement at the international level has seen roles in the Indigenous people's rights, the United Nations, Commonwealth Heads of Governments, and various international organizations over the past 35 years. Wow, not yet even 35. So this is an honor, Les. Pursuing acknowledgement of and respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples. Ghazali, take it away.
Thank you so much, Carson, and thank you for hosting, for stepping in for INI before we start this whole webinar series. INI, also one of the co-moderators of this webinar series. He was, unfortunately, we just learned that he was also struck by COVID-19. Also particularly to him, as it softens praise to him as well. Thank you for stepping in, Carson. Les, it is, what should I tell about Les? There's nothing too much to tell about Les, because once you start talking about his track record, you could talk for days, for weeks maybe. A lot of knowledge in there, a lot of roles, positions the Aboriginal Australian Aboriginals, Pacific and Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples at large. One thing that struck me was the first episode. And there was some kind of discussion going on in the chat between Les and Megan. So I think that's why I would love to start with an easy question. Les, if you could, what is your preference for the declaration? UN DRIP or DRIP?
Yes, Ghazali. First off, hello, thank you very much, Carson, Ghazali. And a big hello to my fellow panelists, many of whom have got experience for a long period of time as well. And a big hello to all the audience out there. It's good to participate in the webinar. The comment, Ghazali, you mentioned is that I made a response because of the reference to the declaration being called the DRIP. And it just reminded me of back in 2007, on the day the declaration was adopted at the General Assembly. We met that evening and had a bit of a celebration and discussion. And one of the first things that came up was, please, let's not call it DRIP. It's not a good acronym. It doesn't sound good when we talk about the DRIP this or the DRIP that, or UNDRIP and so on. And for the most part, that has been the case for these, 13 years now since it was adopted. I think acronyms are acronyms, and sometimes it's necessary to use them, as I often do when I write. But we basically said, let's call it the declaration, or the protocol I try and promote is when we first make a reference to the declaration, that we call it the full name, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then after that, rather than call it DRIP or UNDRIP, let's call it the declaration. And it's a protocol. So it doesn't have to be observed, but it's a little bit like how we have agreed to use Indigenous peoples with capital I and a capital P, whereas the UN protocol is to use small case, lowercase, when using Indigenous or peoples in that sense as well. And there's many other protocols that have come into practice. So I just know that for me, ever since 2007, when I hear the word DRIP, I sort of recoil or respond in some ways, but of course it's not a crime. It's if that's the way people find it easier to communicate. But I felt that there's a lot of people now that have come into this issue of the United Nations Declaration since 2007 and may not have heard of that sort of view that we had on the day, that we felt it was negative connotation And I don't know about in other places, but in Australia, in language, we refer to drips, and drips are usually lowly persons or silly persons and so on. So drip has a meaning of say, oh, look at that drip over there and that sort of thing. So it does mean something in our colloquial usage of the language. So it's simply that. It is the declaration, and it's always hard to roll off the full title of it. It takes up a sentence in itself, but I think the terminology should be, once we've established what we're talking about, that we keep on referring to the declaration and keep that respectable as much as we can.
Les, zooming in then on the declaration and like all rights of Indigenous peoples in general, what is, in your opinion, the biggest concern on the rights of Indigenous peoples? And do you have any ideas, thoughts, or perspectives to overcome them?
Well, that's a big question, and you know, there's all sorts of concerns of all different scale and all sorts of concerns of all different priorities. But for me, the work that I've been involved in prior to then, I remember we took 25 years from the time that this started in the halls of the United Nations to the time that the United Nations accepted it. For us, that was a long time, a quarter of a century. But do you realise now it's actually been 13 or so years since the declaration was actually adopted. And given that we felt drafting over 25 was a long protracted period, unnecessary period, the 13 years since then has really not shown the rate of change or the level of change that we anticipated during those days when we had to get that standard in place as being our benchmark for our futures. And therefore, it is really a high priority to get the declaration into established use, not just in the UN at particular meetings we go to, but particularly back where our people are and where they need to see change on the ground. And I think that that's one of the biggest issues. Every year since the declaration is adopted, we would bring this message back to the UN. We're not seeing the changes happening where it needs to happen with the people. Now that's a negative comment, and there are positive aspects of it in that, I take my experience here in Australia, people are constantly using reference to that. People who've never been to the United Nations, people who haven't participated in national or regional politics and this sort of stuff themselves are referring to use it and to the declaration. So it is in common reference and common usage. So that's a very, very positive sign that we can see because our people always carried a sense of their rights and justice. So they still continue to carry that and have now got a reference point. But it also has to translate in relation to the relationship with the state and the sort of physical changes that need to happen, and particularly empowerment. I mean, in Australia, you know, the government has taken the view for many years now, most of this millennia, that they'll only engage in what they call practical reconciliation, improvement of health, education, employment, etc., housing. And this is what the government calls practical reconciliation. But they're not achieving the targets. The targets that the government has set itself are not being achieved. And of course, we expected that they would not achieve them. And only now they're starting to review and ask questions again about whether they're not achieving it. It all comes down to empowerment. People have to be empowered. And if they're not empowered, if they're not involved in making the decisions and making the forward plans and the future plans and so on, then those other things that come with practical reconciliation don't manifest themselves. So I'll pull up there because I realise we're on a time frame here, but it really is a case of my priority has been since 2007 and 2014 when we had the World Conference to see the declaration put into full acknowledgement and recognition with the state.
Let me zoom in a little bit on you touched upon like the Australia case or situation. What do you see developing in terms of Indigenous peoples of Australia and the state relationships in the next, say, 2 to 3 years? what do you see, and is that in line with what you hope to see?
Well, in fact, we've had a pretty bad time here in Australia in terms of dealing with the government. Let's call it the golden period or the heyday of reform and such in Australia happened during the 1970s. And we saw a lot of advancement up there and into the 80s. And even with the existence of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was established in 1989. However, since 2005, and even before that, it has all gone negative. And for people who know what happened in Canada with the Conservative government, experienced the same thing, that policies were being undone, our organisations were being dismantled, disenfranchised, our communities were being put back into poverty and dependency, and so on. And so the situation has been bleak, and it continues to be bleak because the government has no real objective to see or acknowledge and see that rights are respected here in Australia. They're still on the practical reconciliation side of things, which is more welfare oriented in the way services are delivered and so on. You mentioned in 2 or 3 years what sort of changes we would like to see. Unfortunately, I think that we have to look at things a little bit further than 2 or 3 years. And if, Ghazali, if you allow me time towards the end, a couple of minutes, I want to talk about what I'm calling future proofing, and that this is something I think we need to bring into operation and discuss. How do we future proof our rights and our existence, and what do we need to do now to do that? So the thing with government is that we have to be thinking future proofing, how to get those things happening in government that will ensure that later on we're not having the same battles or we're not losing ground on the whole thing. So I see the next 2 or 3 years as being a very short time frame to get things and to achieve things. And this is where I think the title of your webinars, which is about diplomacy and governance, is exactly the sorts of things that we should be engaging in now. And I'm actually going to emphasise that at the domestic level, at the national level with the state is where to do it, not to go and try and establish better relations at the international level. It just is not working and will not work. We still have an agenda at the international level which we have to pursue, and it's part of where we keep our profile as being peoples with self-determination alive, is at the international level. But we have to pursue the change with the state, which is where the change needs to happen from the colonial days and from patronising and welfare approach and taking of territories, is where we focus on. So for the next 2 or 3 years, concentration on diplomacy, concentration on governance and structuring, and how that relates to the state is really the most important thing.
Well, let me set you up to unpack that a little bit, because I think it's very interesting to talk about future proofing. Also, like how does self-determination, the right to self-determination, fit into that, into your view, and also what's a key thing that the central government must do, and practical things that Indigenous governments or Indigenous peoples can do right now in terms of making sure that future proofing is happening.
Yes, thanks, Ghazali. In fact, I've got very short comments to make here on that particular thing. I've listed 4 things. One is we've got to have direct engagement with the state. So that needs some form of unity, cohesion, structuring as how it goes on. I think the US gave us some idea during the Obama years when the president agreed to have his annual consultation with leaders of the Native Americans and so on, about how am I going, what am I doing, and so on. But that sort of direct engagement with the state is important. We need to have representation, and I suppose it happens all around the world, not only with Indigenous but with non-Indigenous, that people who get up as being representatives and have a leadership title and so on, there's a lot of cynicism behind that, and that's a legacy of colonialism as well. You don't trust the people who get up and say that they're representing your interests. But we have to have representation. We have to work out how that representation is identified. in the past in Australia, there's been what they call opinion leadership, where people have got up and they've made things and people generally say, yeah, they're speaking, that's what I agree, and so on. But they rely upon that person opinion leadership. More recently, there's been this process of elections and choosing representation through quasi-democratic processes and so on. But representation is important, and political profile. There has to be that profile there to engage with government. That's what's going on. We've got a bit of that going on in Australia in terms of treaty discussions that are going on now. We had some with constitutional change, but those things have not held up. The structuring has been poor, it hasn't been strongly supported, and there's probably more opposition than support generating in our communities for those things. We've got to build that political profile and so on. I've also added educational role. So as we would know, and particularly those who live in the parliamentary democracy state nations, that the public has to come along with this. The governments don't just go and do something unless the public want them to do that and are putting them in a position of that. So we have to play an educational role, including amongst their own people, to achieve unity. And the last thing I've mentioned in my list about governance and diplomacy is about lawmaking, because laws are still being made, court decisions, interpretations of laws are still happening and so on. And I know in some places that is going on and has always been going on, but we do have to look more carefully about laws. And in Australia, the thing I've been concentrating on is under the third convention, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, there's a requirement there for special measures and concrete measures to be part of the overcoming of racism. And special measures have criteria established as to what are special measures and what are not, what are discriminatory. And those criteria are important. That is, they have to be temporary measures, they've got to be able to be measured, they've got to have specific purpose as to what they're achieving and how they're to be achieved, so they can be measured along the way, but they also have to have the consent of the people that the legislation applies to. Unfortunately, in Australia, our courts don't accept those criteria. They say that's not in the legislation in Australia of the Racial Discrimination Act. So that's one of the things we'll continue to battle here, is to make sure that lawmaking in Australia by any of our parliaments in a federation have a clear understanding of what is discriminatory law and what is not discriminatory law, and what are special measures to overcome disadvantage and what are concrete measures to ensure that inherent rights to territory, to heritage and so on are protected by law. So these are the things that I think that have to be looked at, particularly in that process.
No, thank you so much, Les. Also, unpacking the future-proofing concept. I think that's very helpful for a lot of people watching, but also going to watch this, as in giving a little bit of practical ideas, tools, like how to ensure the rights of Indigenous peoples, not only like the next 2 to 3 years, but beyond that. Unfortunately, that is a conversation that's going to take a lot longer, and we only have a couple of minutes. Anything, final question that we have not touched upon that you're proud of, maybe curious about, or want peoples or Indigenous peoples to think about? Anything that?
Yeah, thanks, Ghazali. And I will mention future-proofing as a thing I did put down for just to touch upon, and I'll be very quickly just saying that for people like myself, being involved for many years now, I'm seeing many of my colleagues are passing on, and that I see in the Australian context the difficulty about the younger generation coming in, not necessarily having the same experience and knowledge base that we gathered over the time. And so to future-proof, we need to ensure that we are preparing for succession, educating and training, and that we look at what resilience is all about, of how will we continue into the future to be resilient, or are we just simply moving into mainstream middle class Western society? How do our cultures stay the same? How do our traditions? How does our worldview, the most important thing, which is about sustainable use of resources and harmony with the natural environment, and even a different spiritual value about what do we worship? What is the thing that we have a responsibility to. So this is what I call future proofing, and I hope that we'll, over further conversation, be able to give some definition to that and maybe get some global movement in that area. Thank you, Ghazali.
Thank you so much, Les, for your time, for your dedication over the last decades, years, and hopefully that we can enjoy your knowledge and wisdom for a lot longer than that. Carson, you mentioned that like the track record of Les has been longer than, well, it's been longer around than you were actually around. What do you think so far?
Yeah, thank you so much, Les, for your wisdom, knowledge, and of course, you mentioned something really important, sustainable intergenerational knowledge transfer, or something, some sort of, how do we make it sustainable intergenerational wise? And that is a challenge as well in my community, and that is that is my key takeaway today. Even though you said it towards the last part, it's powerful because for my generation, we feel there's that detachment from, for example, for my people, those who took up the fight and won that fight, and now my generation were not aware of. I mean, they didn't get the real fight. They don't even understand. So, and it's important for sustaining the movement. Thank you so much, and thank you, Ghazali.